The question that followed Takeo Kurita for the rest of his life, and he lived until 1977, long enough to be asked it many times, was a simple one. Why did you turn back? He commanded 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, the largest warship ever built. He was close enough to the American landing ships at Leyte that he could have reached them in under an hour. 200,000 soldiers on that beach, nothing between his guns and those ships but a screen of thin-hulled escort carriers running at maximum speed, which was still slower than his slowest vessel. Every number said, "Continue." He turned around. What follows is not a story about heroism, though what Evans and his crew did was genuinely that. It's a story about what happens when a professional confronts something his entire career never taught him to name, and what it cost both men that there was no name for it. If you've never heard this story, share it with someone who should. Stories like this disappear. That's the only reason I make them. The bridge of USS Johnston, October 25th, 1944. The Philippine Sea before dawn, still dark, the water running black and warm. Commander Ernest Evans stands at the bridge rail and has already made his decision. He made it probably long before this morning, possibly the moment he took command. Johnston is 2,050 tons, 5 5-inch guns, a Fletcher-class destroyer built for speed and torpedo attacks and anti-submarine work, not for standing in the path of battleships. Her hull is thin enough that the men who built her understood exactly what a 14-inch shell would do to it. Everyone aboard understands this. Evans is not pretending otherwise. A few hours earlier, according to crew survivor accounts collected after the war, he had addressed the crew over the intercom. He didn't dress it up. He said, "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." That last sentence is the one worth sitting with. Not, "we will try." Not, "we will hold out as long as we can." We will do what damage we can. It's a machinist's sentence, an engineer's sentence. It describes a task, not a sacrifice, a job to be done within the available time, with the available tools, against whatever comes. There is no drama in it. That's what makes it so hard to forget. Evans was 36 years old, Choctaw and Cherokee descent, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, landlocked 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. He had wanted to go to sea since boyhood and had gotten there through the Naval Academy and a career that moved him steadily toward this bridge, this ship, this specific morning. He was, by any honest reckoning, exactly the officer the Navy had intended to produce, technically precise, calm under pressure, capable of making decisions without needing a guarantee first. He had no guarantee. He knew this. Over the horizon, invisible, not yet even a rumor on the radar, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of Yamato and looked toward Leyte Gulf with the focused clarity of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why. His mission was clear. His numbers were decisive. Between his fleet and the American landing ships, his intelligence indicated, stood a thin screen of escort carriers and their escorts. Light, slow, built for other work, not a serious obstacle. In Kurita's professional vocabulary, there was a category for every threat his fleet might encounter. He had spent 40 years learning those categories, refining them, testing them in real water against real enemies. His mind was a filing system for naval warfare, organized, complete, tested under fire. Johnston was not yet in that filing system. She was below the horizon. 2,050 tons in a sea that held on the other side 72,000 tons of Yamato alone. Kurita hadn't seen her yet. He would in about an hour. What he saw would not fit in any file he had. But that's not what concerns us yet. What concerns us is what Kurita was already carrying onto that bridge, and it wasn't just the weight of command. 2 days earlier, in the Palawan Passage, an American submarine had put 4 torpedoes into his flagship, Otago. The ship went down in 18 minutes. Kurita went into the water. He was pulled out, transferred his flag, and continued the mission. He had been in the water. His flagship was on the bottom of the Palawan Passage. He was on this bridge because he had kept going after that. Which means that when Johnston finally appeared over the horizon, Kurita was already a man who had absorbed something that would have stopped most people and moved forward anyway. A professional who had already proved to himself and to anyone watching that he didn't break easily. 2 professionals, 1 ocean. One of them had already decided what he was going to do. The other was still confident that the outcome was a matter of arithmetic. What neither of them knew yet was that they were about to fight a battle with completely different weapons, and that only one of them understood what those weapons actually were. Stand on the bridge of Yamato and try to understand what Kurita was working with. The ship beneath him displaced 72,000 tons of water. Her 9 main guns fired shells that weighed 1.5 tons each, a single round heavier than most of the cars on an American street. Her turrets alone, 3 of them, each weighed more than a Fletcher-class destroyer. Not more than a destroyer's guns, more than the entire ship. When Yamato's broadside fired at full elevation, the concussion was physically felt by aircraft flying 2,000 feet overhead. She was not a warship in the way most warships are warships. She was a category. Kurita had been at sea since 1908. He had commanded destroyers, cruisers, a fleet. He knew every class of vessel that any navy had put into the Pacific. He had a professional's instinct for what a ship could and couldn't do, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body, not just the mind, built from years of standing on bridges in weather that made calculation difficult and paying attention anyway. What he commanded on October 25, 1944, was not a fleet in the ordinary sense either. Center force, 4 battleships, including Yamato, 8 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, had been assembled for one purpose under the operation the Japanese called Shogo, which translates roughly as Victory Operation. The strategic logic was cold and clear. American forces had landed at Leyte in the Philippines. If those landings succeeded, Japan lost access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Without that oil, the Navy stopped moving. Without the Navy, the home islands were open. The Philippines were not a strategic objective. They were the valve. The plan was intricate. Admiral Ozawa's northern force, what remained of Japan's carrier fleet, largely stripped of aircraft and trained pilots by this point in the war, would sail south and draw the American fast carriers away from Leyte. Halsey would chase them. That was the assumption, and it was a good one. Halsey was aggressive, and Ozawa's carriers were a target he couldn't ignore. While Halsey moved north, Kurita would bring center force through the San Bernardino Strait and fall on the American landing fleet from the north. A second Japanese force would come from the south simultaneously. The landing ships would be caught between. 2 days before the engagement, an American submarine had put 4 torpedoes into Kurita's flagship Otago in the Palawan Passage. The Otago went down in 18 minutes. Kurita went into the water, was pulled out, and transferred his flag to Yamato. He lost his chief of staff. He lost the ship he'd sailed into this operation. He had been in the Philippine Sea, in the water, watching his command sink, and he had continued the mission. This matters, because on the morning of the 25th, when center force emerged from the San Bernardino Strait into the Sibuyan Sea and turned south toward Leyte, Kurita was not a man coasting on numbers and confidence. He was a man who had already absorbed a serious blow and kept moving. His certainty that morning wasn't complacency. It was the settled assurance of a professional who had tested himself against bad news and come out the other side still functional. He had also watched the previous day as American aircraft found Musashi, the sister ship to Yamato, the same class, the same impossible tonnage, and sank her. It took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes and most of a day. She went under at 19:23 hours on October 24th. Kurita saw it. He had ordered a course reversal during that attack, which American signals intelligence had briefly interpreted as a retreat, and then turned back and continued through the strait. He lost Musashi and continued. By the morning of the 25th, he had been hit hard and kept coming, lost his flagship and kept coming, watched the unsinkable go under and kept coming. His fleet was smaller than it had been. But what remained, 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, was still, by raw calculation, one of the most powerful surface formations assembled in the Pacific War. And ahead of him, according to his intelligence, a light screen of escort carriers and their small escorts. No fleet carriers, no fast battleships. Vessels built for convoy protection and ground support, not fleet engagements. Slow, thin-hulled. The math was not complicated. This was the mind, tested, battered, still professionally intact, that would look through his binoculars in about 40 minutes and see a single 2,000-ton destroyer coming toward him at flank speed. What he thought he saw and what was actually coming at him were 2 different things. But that gap between Kurita's calculation and Evans's decision is the entire story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. I cover one story like this every week. There is one detail worth pausing on before we get to contact. Kurita's after-action report, written after the battle, describes the attacking American force as including multiple cruisers and fleet carriers. He wasn't lying, and he probably wasn't guessing. At the speeds and distances involved, in the smoke and the confusion of the engagement, his officers reported what their training told them they were seeing. The escort carriers, running at full speed with their flight decks into the wind to launch aircraft, looked, from a distance, to men who expected fleet carriers like fleet carriers. His intelligence picture was wrong before Johnston fired a single shot. He was sailing into a battle he had already, without knowing it, misread. 6:57 in the morning. The radar operator on Yamato reports surface contacts to the southeast. Kurita crosses to the plot. His staff leans in. The contacts resolve. Escort carriers running northeast. Small destroyer escorts around them. The picture confirms what he expected. A light screen, exactly where his intelligence said it would be. Then someone says, "One of the escorts is turning toward them." Kurita raises his binoculars. What he saw was USS Johnston, 2,050 tons, coming out of a rain squall at flank speed with her bow pointed directly at center force. At this distance, roughly 10 miles, maybe a little more, she was a gray shape against gray water, throwing a white wake, moving fast. His staff would have identified her class within seconds. Fletcher-class destroyer, standard armament. Nothing unusual about the ship herself. What was unusual was the direction she was moving. A destroyer's role in fleet doctrine, Japanese, American, British, any navy that had thought seriously about surface warfare, was specific and well understood. Destroyers screened capital ships. They attacked with torpedoes under cover of a fleet engagement, when larger ships had already fixed the enemy's attention and damaged their formation. They did not make independent attacks on battleships in open water without fleet support. This wasn't timidity encoded into doctrine. It was arithmetic. A destroyer's 5-inch guns could not meaningfully damage a battleship's armor at any range, and a battleship's main battery could sink a destroyer with a single round. You didn't need to have been to sea for 40 years to understand this. It was physics. Kurita understood it the way he understood how to breathe. His gunnery officers were already tracking Johnston. The range was still long, 18,000 yards, roughly 10 miles, but closing fast. Someone on his staff noted the contact and moved to the next item. There was a fleet to manage. The escort carriers were the priority. The destroyer was a notation. This is the thing that's hard to communicate across 80 years. Kurita's assessment of Johnston in those first seconds was not contemptuous. Contempt implies taking something seriously enough to dismiss it. What he felt was probably closer to professional accounting, a small entry in a large ledger, handled automatically, already moving to the next column. One destroyer, closing. It would be dealt with. On Johnston's bridge, Evans was watching the same ships Kurita was watching from the other direction. What he saw was 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers emerging from the northwest, the largest surface formation he would ever see in his life, the largest most people in the United States Navy would ever see in their lives. His crew saw it too. According to survivor accounts gathered after the war, the initial reaction on the bridge was something close to silence. Then Evans gave his orders. He told his helmsman to come to course 275 degrees. He told his engineer to make flank speed. He told his torpedo officer to prepare to fire. He was pointing Johnston directly at Yamato. His gunnery officer, according to crew accounts, asked for clarification. Evans, as best as anyone remembers it, said something short that meant, "Yes, that is what I mean." Then he ordered Johnston's 5-inch guns to open fire at a target they could not damage at this range, to announce their position, to draw attention, to do something rather than nothing while the range closed. The shells fell short. They were always going to fall short. That was not the point. At 18,000 yards, Kurita's gunnery officers requested permission to engage the destroyer. Kurita gave it. Yamato's forward turrets, 3 guns each, firing 1.5-ton shells, trained onto the small gray shape still coming out of the northwest. The mathematics were clean. The shell would cross 10 miles in under a minute. Johnston's maximum speed was 35 knots. She couldn't maneuver fast enough to make the targeting calculation significantly more difficult. At this range, with this disparity in firepower, the engagement had a predictable duration. The shells were fired. They hit the water around Johnston in columns, massive, white, each one a tower of displaced sea rising 60 feet or more. Straddles. Not hits, not yet, but close enough that the crew felt the concussion through the hull. Johnston kept coming. Kurita watched the small ship drive through the shell splashes and did not yet change his assessment. Ships drove through shell splashes. That was what you did when someone was shooting at you and you couldn't turn away fast enough. You kept moving. You absorbed the probability until your luck or theirs ran out. He gave orders about the carriers. He had a fleet to manage. Behind him, on Johnston's bridge, Evans had his eyes on the range clock. 12,000 yards. Still too far for torpedoes. He kept coming. At 9,000 yards, Evans fired his torpedoes. 10 of them. Every one Johnston carried. The range was still long for a torpedo attack, long enough that the Japanese ships had time to maneuver, long enough that any gunnery officer calculating the intercept would say the odds of a hit were not good. Evans knew this. He fired anyway, because 9,000 yards was the closest he'd been able to get while still having torpedoes to fire. And waiting for a better angle meant waiting until Yamato's guns found him, and by then there would be no angle at all. He gave the order the way you give an order when the decision is already made, and the only remaining variable is execution. The torpedoes ran. On Yamato's bridge, Kurita watched the destroyer and felt, for the first time that morning, something he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't the torpedoes. Torpedoes from a single destroyer were a tactical problem, real, requiring response, but manageable. His ships were already maneuvering. The formation was breaking to comb the torpedo tracks, each captain making his own calculation about angle and speed. Standard procedure, executed cleanly. What Kurita couldn't classify was the ship itself. Johnston was still closing. After firing every torpedo she carried, after exhausting the one weapon that gave a destroyer any leverage against capital ships, she was accelerating, back towards center force. Her 5-inch guns were firing continuously, at targets they couldn't damage, at a rate that meant she was burning through her ammunition with no apparent concern for what came after. There was no what came after in what Johnston was doing. That was the thing Kurita's mind kept returning to. Every tactical action he'd ever seen, on every ocean, carried within it an implied future, a position to reach, a window to exploit, a moment when the risk would convert into advantage. You attacked to achieve something. You spent ammunition to gain something. You closed range because closing range gave you options you didn't have before. Johnston was spending everything she had with no visible theory of what came next. Kurita was trying to find the logic. There had to be a logic. A fleet somewhere over the horizon, perhaps. American fast carriers coming south. And Evans was holding center force in place until they arrived. It was the only framework that made the destroyer's behavior rational. A sacrificial delay. A professional calculation, brutal but legible. He ordered his staff to check for contacts to the east. One of Johnston's torpedoes hit the heavy cruiser Kumano, blew off her bow. Evans didn't see it happen. He was already in the smoke. After the torpedo run, Johnston turned and made smoke. Long chemical clouds laid across the water between center force and the escort carriers running northeast. She was working now as a screen, buying time for ships that couldn't outrun what was behind them. And she was doing it by staying close enough to the Japanese fleet that firing through the smoke at the carriers meant firing in Johnston's direction too. This was not courage in any abstract sense. It was tactics, executed by a crew that had trained for exactly this, and was now doing it in conditions that training could approximate, but never fully simulate. The 5-inch guns kept firing. The helmsman kept the ship moving in irregular patterns, making the targeting calculation slightly harder, keeping her alive for another minute, and then another. 3 of Yamato's 14-inch shells hit Johnston in the space of about 90 seconds. The first 2 struck the engine room. 1 boiler gone. Speed dropped immediately, from flank speed to 17 knots, roughly half what she'd been making. The 3rd hit the forward fire room. The men inside did not survive. Power to the forward guns went out. The ship was on fire in 2 places and running on 1 engine, and still in the smoke, still moving, still shooting with the guns that had power. According to crew survivor accounts, Evans's response to the damage reports was to keep shooting. He ordered the remaining guns to continue firing and the helmsman to maintain course. Kurita received the damage reports. Kumano, bow gone, out of the engagement. Johnston, hit 3 times with 14-inch shells, still shooting. He read that second line and looked up from the report. A Fletcher-class destroyer, 2,050 tons, thin hull, no armor worth the name, had absorbed 3 14-inch shells and was still in the fight. His staff confirmed it. The radar contact was still there, still moving, still producing gun flashes in the smoke. 3 14-inch shells. Kurita had seen ships die from 1. He stood on Yamato's bridge and looked at the smoke and thought, and this is reconstruction, because he never described this moment in any account he left behind. But he almost certainly thought what any professional would think when their framework produces the wrong answer twice in a row. What am I actually looking at? He still hadn't found the American fleet to the east. There was no fleet to the east. 2 hours into the engagement, USS Johnston had no business being afloat. 1 engine, fires in 2 compartments, power gone to half her guns. Her bridge had taken a hit that wounded Evans, both arms, badly enough that the men around him could see it, and he had stayed on the bridge. She had fired every torpedo she carried, burned through most of her 5-inch ammunition, made smoke until the smoke generators gave out, and then turned back into the Japanese formation to keep shooting with whatever still worked. She had also, at some point in the confusion of the battle, rammed a Japanese destroyer. Whether this was intentional or the result of the chaos on the bridge with one engine and reduced steering, the survivors weren't certain, and Evans never said, because Evans didn't survive to say anything. Kurita's staff tracked her throughout. This was the part they couldn't file away. There is a specific experience that professionals in any field recognize. The moment when something stops fitting the framework you've spent your career building. It doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It arrives as a small wrongness, a result the calculation shouldn't have produced, an output that keeps coming back different from what the formula predicts. You check the formula. The formula is correct. You check the input. The input is correct. The answer is still wrong. Kurita had been checking his formula for 2 hours. Johnston was still there. Not Johnston as a threat in any conventional sense. His ships had hit her repeatedly, with guns that should have ended the conversation after the first salvo. She couldn't hurt Yamato. She couldn't stop center force. She was one destroyer with one engine and diminishing ammunition, doing things that a ship in her condition had no logical reason to keep doing. And yet, every time his staff reported her position, she was still in the fight, still between center force and the escort carriers, still shooting, still making his formation work harder than a single 2,000-ton destroyer should be able to make it work. She had become, in some way Kurita couldn't quantify, a fixed point around which the engagement kept organizing itself, not because of what she could do to him, because of what she was doing, continuously, without apparent limit. He kept waiting for her to reach her limit. She didn't reach it. Here is what Kurita could not have known, standing on Yamato's bridge. Evans had given his crew the terms of this engagement before it started. We will do what damage we can. There was no clause in that sentence about afterward, no provision for a moment when the damage doing became impossible and the rational response was to disengage and preserve what remained. The sentence didn't contain that option. It contained one task and one variable, the quantity of damage possible within the available time. And Evans had handed that sentence to his crew and then driven toward the Japanese fleet to find out what the variable was. Kurita's entire professional framework was built on the assumption that every opponent was, at some level, solving the same equation he was. How do I achieve my objective at acceptable cost? That equation had a kill switch built into it. When the cost exceeded what the objective was worth, you stopped, you withdrew. You preserved what you had left for the next engagement. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It was how you stayed in the war long enough to win it. Evans had removed the kill switch, not in a suicidal way, not in the way of a man who had given up on surviving, in the way of a man who had looked at the equation and decided that one of the variables wasn't actually variable. The cost was whatever the cost was. That part was already fixed. The only thing left to optimize was the damage. Kurita had no file for this. He had files for courage. He had files for aggressive tactics, for calculated risk, for the kind of determined attack that accepts serious losses in pursuit of a specific objective. He had seen men do brave things inside rational frameworks, and he understood and respected it. What he was watching Johnston do didn't fit inside a rational framework. It wasn't brave in any way his training had a word for. It was something else, something that kept producing the wrong output every time he ran it through the formula. His intelligence picture was already wrong. He still believed he was facing fleet carriers somewhere in the smoke. He had been searching for the American fast battleships he was certain were just over the horizon. There had to be an explanation for why a destroyer was doing this. There had to be a larger force it was covering. There was no larger force. There was one ship, one engine, one crew, and a captain with both arms wounded who was still on the bridge. At roughly 9:25 in the morning, Kurita gave the order to withdraw. The official reason, recorded in his after-action report, was that he had decided to regroup his scattered formation before proceeding to Leyte Gulf. His ships had spread across miles of ocean during the engagement. Coordination had broken down. He needed to reassemble before attacking the landing fleet. This was true. It was also not the whole truth, and Kurita probably knew it. He had turned back with the landing ships still within reach. 200,000 American soldiers on that beach, the supply fleet, the transports, everything the Japanese operation had been designed to destroy, sitting 30 miles away, undefended. His formation, even scattered, was capable of reaching it. His own officers, according to post-war testimony, argued for continuing the attack. He turned back. He never fully explained why. In post-war interviews, he returned to the tactical rationale, the scattered formation, the uncertainty about what was waiting for him over the horizon. He never described, in any account he left behind, what it felt like to stand on Yamato's bridge and watch Johnston. Whether he recognized in that moment that his framework had failed him, whether he understood what he was turning away from. The silence in those accounts is its own kind of answer. USS Johnston sank at 10:10 in the morning, 2 hours and 40 minutes after Evans ordered the attack. She went down by the stern, slowly enough that survivors could get clear. Evans was last seen on the fantail, both arms wounded, unable to use his hands, directing men to the life rafts. He was in the water when she went under. His body was never found. The Japanese destroyer Yukikaze came through the area where Johnston had been. Her captain, Tameichi Hara, stood on the bridge and watched the wreck go down. Then, according to his memoir published in 1961, he came to attention and saluted. He wrote afterward that he didn't have a word for what he'd witnessed, that Johnston had behaved like nothing in his experience of naval warfare, that he stood at attention because it was the only response his training gave him to something his training had never prepared him for. Which is almost exactly what Kurita had discovered from a different direction, with different consequences 30 miles to the north. The opening question this video started with, "Why did you turn back?" was never really about tactics. It wasn't about the scattered formation or the phantom fleet on the horizon, or the intelligence reports that were wrong before the first shot was fired. It was about this. Kurita had spent 40 years building a complete vocabulary for naval warfare. Every ship, every tactic, every possible engagement had a category, a response, a logical next step. His vocabulary was real and hard-earned and had worked everywhere he'd ever used it. Johnston was not in his vocabulary, and a man who encounters something outside his vocabulary, something that keeps producing the wrong answer no matter how carefully he checks the formula, does not keep advancing. He stops. He reassesses. He looks for the explanation he must have missed. He turns back. Evans knew this. Whether he knew it consciously, whether it was calculation or instinct, or simply the natural result of a man who had already decided that the cost was fixed and only the damage was variable. He knew it. He had found the one weapon that Kurita's tonnage and his 18-inch guns and his 40 years at sea had left him no defense against. Not torpedoes, not 5-inch shells. The decision to stop counting. Kurita filed his report and sailed home. The war ended 9 months later. He survived it, which most of the men at Leyte Gulf didn't. He lived in a small house outside Tokyo, gave occasional interviews to historians, answered questions about the battle in careful, measured language. The tactical rationale, the scattered formation, the uncertainty about what was waiting ahead, and died in 1977 at the age of 88. For 33 years, he kept being asked why he turned back. He never quite answered it, not fully. Not in a way that closed the question. 33 years is a long time to be still looking for the words. Tameichi Hara, who came to attention on the bridge of Yukikaze and saluted Johnston as she went under, wrote about that moment 17 years later in his memoir. He called it the most affecting thing he'd witnessed in the entire war. Not the largest battle, not the worst losses, the small ship that wouldn't stop. He said he didn't have a category for it. He was a professional in the same sense Kurita was, a man who had organized his understanding of naval warfare into a system precise enough to act on in real time, under fire, with other men's lives depending on how well he read it. His system was good. It had kept him alive through the whole Pacific War, which almost nobody in the Japanese destroyer fleet managed. Johnston fell outside it. Here is what Evans had understood, or decided, or simply was, and the distinction matters less than the result. The framework Kurita operated inside was a closed system. Tonnage, range, gun caliber, probability of hit, exchange rate. It was built to evaluate opponents who were also inside it, running the same calculations from the other direction, moving toward the point where the numbers said stop and stopping. The whole system worked because both sides accepted its terms. You fought until the math turned against you, then you found a new position, or withdrew, or you didn't. Evans had stepped outside the language, not irrationally. The numbers were perfectly clear to him. 2,050 tons against 72,000. 5-inch guns against 18-inch. One ship against a fleet that could have sunk her with a single round, and very nearly did. He read those numbers correctly and then made a decision the numbers couldn't contain. The cost was already fixed. The outcome was already known. The only remaining question was how much damage he could do before the fixed outcome arrived. When you fix the cost, the entire calculation changes. You're no longer solving for survival. You're solving for damage. And a man genuinely solving only for damage, a man who has finished with the other question before the first shot is fired, doesn't respond to the things that stop everyone else. He doesn't respond to hits. He doesn't respond to fires. He doesn't respond to the arithmetic of exchange rates and calibers, because none of that touches the variable he's actually working. Kurita had never seen this. More precisely, his framework had never built a category for it, because his framework assumed, reasonably, professionally, correctly in almost every other engagement he'd been in, that survival was always in play, that at some point the cost would become high enough that the opponent would respond to it. Johnston's cost was already at its maximum before the first torpedo left the tube. What Kurita was watching, without a word for it, was a man who had solved the hardest problem in this particular fight before it started. Not by finding a way to win, by removing the constraint that made the fight calculable in the first place. Evans was 36 years old, born landlocked in Oklahoma, 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. He had wanted to go to sea since boyhood and had worked his way there through the Naval Academy and a decade of careful, professional service that moved him steadily toward command. He was given a ship. He was given a crew. He was given a morning in the Philippine Sea when the largest surface formation in the Pacific War came over the horizon, and he looked at it and gave his orders. He is buried at sea in the sense that there's nothing else to say. No grave. His body was never recovered. What exists is the record, crew survivor accounts, radar tracks, after-action reports, a Medal of Honor citation written after the war by people who weren't there. And the withdrawal, Kurita turning north with his 4 battleships and his 8 cruisers, and Yamato still floating 30 miles from the beach. Evans never knew that happened. He was already in the water before Kurita gave the order. 200,000 American soldiers on that beach, the supply fleet intact, the transports safe, all of it the direct consequence of a decision made by a man who didn't live to see it produce anything. That's the part that sits with you, not the battle, not the tonnage disparity, or the 2 hours and 40 minutes, or even Hara's salute. The fact that Evans made his decision in the dark, before dawn, before contact, before anyone could tell him what it would accomplish. And it accomplished exactly what it needed to, for people he would never speak to again, on a beach he would never reach. He didn't do it for the outcome. He did it because it was the job, and the job was what damage he could do in the time available, and he did the job. Kurita spent 33 years with the question. Evans had answered his before the battle started. That asymmetry, a dead man at peace with his decision, a living man still searching for the explanation he never quite found, is exactly what Hara was saluting when he came to attention on the bridge of Yukikaze. Not the wreck going under, not the losses, which were real. The fact of what Evans had understood and what it had cost him, and what it had done to the fleet of the man who spent the rest of his life unable to fully explain why he turned around. Kurita had spent 40 years learning to defeat every threat his training could name. Evans had simply removed himself from the list. And there is no gun ever built, not on Johnston, not on Yamato, not on any ship in any navy on any ocean, that answers a man who has already agreed to the cost. One question for the comments. If Kurita had kept going, if he'd reached those landing ships, what changes? The Pacific War? The timeline? Something else? Leave it below. I read every one.